Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Bryce Acer. I'm with 6 Dimensions, and today we're going to be going over the Adobe Experience Manager 6.0's new translation integration framework. We will be recording this in case you have to drop off, and we will make that recording available after the webinar. And again, thanks for joining. So a little bit about myself. I'm a solution architect, tech lead with 6 Dimensions. I've been in the web content management space for actually a little over 8 years at this point. And I've actually been dealing with CQ way back as far as before actually Adobe acquired Day. Probably about 5 years, maybe a little bit longer now, back in the 4i days. I actually helped participate in this project as well as my sponsor at Adobe. I was architect of this translation integration framework, and we are actually currently working on a 6.1 release that I believe is either a quarterly or might be a year in advance. There are some service packs too. So, yeah, so let's dig in. So today we're going to be talking about the new translation API that is shipped in Adobe's 6.0 release of Adobe Experience Manager. And it's going to be more focused to a developer implementer perspective, followed by steps for configuration and a live demo of the out-of-the-box components. I'm also going to show a test page, very bare bones, but go into some of the code in the back end that calls through the API from the front end and explain how to develop components to leverage the new translation API. A little bit more detailed. We're going to go through, what exactly is the translation integration framework. Talk about the API, which there's a couple different classes that get shipped with this API. We're going to talk about implementing the API, so creating connectors to leverage this new API and to provide functionality that goes above and beyond the current connector that's shipped with the product, which is a Microsoft Bing translation engine. We're going to talk then about the cloud configurations that go with this and how to configure sites to leverage the API, as well as how to hook up the content to specifically like Microsoft credentials. And then we're going to do a little demo, show some of the new AEM Communities Forum components on the Geometrics Media site, as well as, like I said, dig into some of the code on what's been dubbed the developer test page. So I'm sure many are wondering, what is the translation integration framework, and what does it do? So this framework, it provides a standardized focal point for building machine translation components and functionality. And by machine translation, we really mean, typically in the past, a lot of workflows will go through out to translation authors and generators and actual humans doing the translation. What this API hopes to accomplish is providing a framework to build components as well as connectors to allow real-time machine translation of content, of sites, of user-generated content, of even generating new locales of websites. This API is exposed and published, so anyone can implement it. And it applies to both the front end, this applies to both the front end components as well as back end connectors. And that really goes into the point of being the standardized focal point. What we're really trying to do is connect front end components and have them call through this API, and they can essentially be, they essentially don't need to know who is actually doing, or what service rather, is doing the translation in the back end. And it also allows a single component to be built and leverage multiple translation engines, such as Microsoft, Google, Clay Tablet. There's many out there. And the component doesn't need to know the complexities of each specific machine translation implementation. Each engine is different. They have different APIs. They have different credentials, different access tokens, keys, whatnot. And from when you're building a front-end component, you don't need to know that when calling through this API. It's the simplicity of it. This also allows companies to integrate new service providers, build new connectors, essentially implement this API wherever necessary. There's new machine translations popping up every day, so there's going to be plenty of room for new connectors out there. And it also allows us to target specific machine translation engines based on business rules, such as content categories, such as your marketing data versus your user-generated content. So your real-time forums, blog posts, comment sections. You might want that to go through a quicker engine, but maybe your marketing data is more, it's obviously more important, and you want that to go through another engine that might cost more, but it would probably be a more accurate translation, possibly. It also allows you to target different engines for language direction. So maybe a specific provider is good when translating from English into German, but is poor in other languages, and you'd like to use a different language provider when translating from Chinese into French. So really the main functionality of this new translation integration framework is threefold. It allows translation, so translating string or an array of strings from one language to another. Detection, so given a sentence, a string, or an array of strings, determine what language that is, and as well as translation memory. And this goes into allowing possibly your community or even respected moderators to edit, update machine translations, to capture those machine translations, rank those. And what that allows is that a future translation of the same sentence, if the machine translation wasn't accurate, in possibly your company's case, maybe there's reserved words, or it wasn't as accurate as you'd like it to be. This allows you to make updates to those and rank those edits, updates. And then in the future, when calling that specific translation engine for the exact same input, it would respond back with the highest ranked translation. So the new API resides in the com.adobe.granite.translation namespace. Everything is underneath that. This is currently only in the AEM Quick Start. What that means is this is an AEM 6.0, but is not in the Granite Quick Start. And for those of you that know how the sausage is made, essentially. Right now we're working on migrating this into the Granite Quick Start, where it will eventually reside. And what that will do is give Adobe the ability to have this be leveraged across many of their products, not just in AEM. But currently, in the current version, it is just in AEM 6.0. The version that ships with 6.0 of the API is the 2.00 version. And a little bit about this, there's a class that ships with the API that's called a translation manager. And this is a Sling service that contains the logic to determine what factories, and I'll use that term a lot, but when you think of factory, think of a connector. Factories are available and which to use. So it's sort of the routing logic of the whole system, the brain, if you will. It maintains the list of all available connectors in the system. And it's really simple to get the translation manager. So from Sling, you just sling.get service, give it to the translation manager class, and you got your translation manager. And from there, you can grab your translation service objects, and we will show that here in a little bit. So one of the classes that comes with the Translation API is this Translation Service Factory. Translation Service Factory is what creates connector specific. And I really should define this, but when we say connector, there's two parts. So the API would be the nexus. Anything on the front end would be components, workflows, whatever, using and leveraging the API. And on the back end, you have what we call connectors. And you can have multiple connectors in a system, and each connector is specific to a machine translation service. So for example, out of the box, AEM 6.0 ships with one connector, and that is a Microsoft connector. And that connector implements the API, and it has specific logic in that implementation to call out to Microsoft's Bing translation service. And so it handles the authentication. It also handles the mapping of the language codes to the Microsoft specific language codes, the category mappings, and everything specific to Microsoft's machine translation engine. And the Translation Service Factory class is that specific it contains the logic to register the connector within the system with that translation manager that we just talked about. It does this with this bind unbind classes that are logic that's contained within the translation manager, and it listens for an activation or an unactivation of a translation service factory object. This translation manager maintains this map of all the unique factories, connectors available in the system. And so this translation manager, which is installed in the system, and you don't actually have to implement that, handles the translation service factory objects. So you don't have to, either on the front end or really on the back end. And a translation service factory must contain a unique factory ID associated with this connector. And this is what it registers itself under. And that is the quote-unquote ID that the translation manager holds and maintains in its list. And you do that by adding a property to your translation service factory. And that value has to be unique. And then also, when you're creating your class, you can give it specific labels and descriptions for your OSGI service. But this only allows one unique factory name each factory must have a unique name in the system. Just a little bit of clarification on that. So, such as the Microsoft connector, its unique ID is Microsoft. And if another connector was installed into the system with the ID Microsoft, it actually wouldn't install because it has to be unique value. The second and probably the most important class object within the API is the translation service. This is really the meat and potatoes. So this service object contains the core, the machine translation functionality. And this is the object that's obtained by calling the create translation service function of the translation manager class. And there are currently two create functions that you can in the translation manager. The first is via supplying a string, which would be a unique factory name. So in the case I just gave, if you said create translation service and you provide the string Microsoft, the translation manager would look into its factory listings and pull out the connector that had the ID Microsoft. The second create translation service implementation is to pass in a resource, and this is such as the page that the component lives on. And then there's routing logic built in with the translation manager that, based on that passed in resource, will determine which is the best connector in the system to provide to the translation API. And this is typically done via looking up cloud configurations on the system, but there is some other logic. And the second function is guaranteed to return you a translation service object, provided that there is a connector registered within the system. To further clarify, the first function, if you call it for a specific factory name and that factory is not installed in the system, it will return an exception. Factory not installed, I think is the error code, something like that. There's three main parts and or groups of functions within the translation service: helper methods, translation detection methods, and storage and retrieval methods. The helper methods, such as is direction supported, allow connectors to respond with their specific implementation limitations. The reason that we added these is not every machine translation engine has all the functionality that's contained within our API. They also don't all support all the possible combinations of language translation that the API allows. So certain engines might translate English into French, German, Spanish, but they might not translate English into Cambodian. Or they might support, Japanese into Chinese, Chinese into Japanese, but maybe not Chinese into Thai, something like that. So this allows the connector implementation to respond. These helper methods allow the connector implementation to respond to components on the front end and letting them know, yes, we do support this type of functionality, or no, we don't. Also, many connectors, many machine translation engines don't support translation memory yet. Some do, some don't. So that is also another use of the helper methods. The second group is the translation and detection methods. These are the core of the translation integration framework. Should be pretty straightforward, but they are the translate string, translate array, detect string type functions. And lastly is storage and retrieval methods. And these are used for translation memory and ranking of translations, which is very important. And so typically a machine translation engine, and obviously I'm going to speak generally about machine translation engines, and they're all across the board, but for translation memory, there's a specific ranking involved in the actual machine translation, and then the translation memory bank allows you to essentially augment, like I was talking about before, augment a machine translation with a review, a better edit to the translation. And you can have those automatically ranked, or you could have a workflow process ranking those, such as allowing the user community to actually rate and rank translations on your site. Typically, in that type of scenario, you wouldn't want your community to automatically have their ranked edits to a translation be higher ranked than the machine translation, because then they would automatically show up. And you typically want those to go through a workflow process, a review process. Otherwise, your community can take control of content on your site. But this allows you to rank community edits, store those community edits, retrieve those community edits, and see what are out there. And they would typically be ranked lower than the machine translation itself, and thus the machine translation would still be returned given the exact same input, the exact same string for translation. There's also a new class, the translation exception. This is an extension to Java's exception class. The extension adds a translation error code that allows us to throw translation exceptions from the API with specific codes for different scenarios, such as timeouts, the connector not configured, improper credentials, no connectors installed in the system. There's many different exception codes, and allows the front end to catch specifically a translation exception and check for different types of error codes to handle them in different ways, such as notifying users that the credentials are improper, or your license has expired, or such like that, or that there's no engines available. This overrides the toString method to add the error code to the exception message. And it's expected that connector implementations throw translation exceptions with relevant error codes, so that front-end components can respond appropriately. Okay, so implementing the API. The only two classes that are necessary to create a new connector are a translation service impl class and a translation service factory impl class, and they don't have to be named that. The service implementation should extend the abstract translation service while implementing the translation service, and the factory should extend the abstract translation service factory while implementing the translation service factory. That's not a hard set rule, but I would be hard pressed to find a scenario where you would not want to extend those abstract classes. The factory must have a unique factory name. That's very important. We talked about before. This is the quote unquote ID that the translation manager uses. It has to be unique to the system that the connector is installed into. And the factory should return an instance of this connector-specific translation service implementation class. So essentially, the translation service factory that it handles registering with the translation manager, and it is the pass-through during the create translation service call that will return this specific translation service implementation class. And I just do have a note here that the translation service factory can create either a new translation service object or just maintain an individual one within the factory itself, the factory service itself. And that obviously would be deterministic based on performance. Depending on how you implement your class, it might be better performance to have one translation service object that's shared system-wide, or it might be beneficial to create multiple ones. And actually, that's something we've been toying around with the Microsoft connector itself. We actually just changed it from a multiple instance object to a individual instance object, and did notice just slight performance improvements there. And again, it's not part of 6.0. That's actually going to be in 6.1. So the abstract classes that I alluded to before, they provide functions that can be leveraged by all connectors, such as the get default category, validate language code, and access to the translation service info object. So like I said, I highly recommend extending the abstract, because then you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The translation service info object, this is an object that contains information specific to each connector, so such as the name, which is the ID, a label, so UI specific name of the connector for use in like drop downs or different UI centric components data, and as well as attribution text. So in crediting a machine translation, you'll see that in the demo, but Microsoft's is translations by Microsoft, basically, for the attribution text. And it allows components to leverage those data points. The abstract translation service class also handles the language and category mappings. And it's recommended to create connector-specific mappings for a new connector, and specifically within that location. That's not a hard set rule, but that is leveraged. So it's definitely recommended to have that there. And these mappings contain one-to-one language as well as category mappings specific to the unique connector. And I'll show you that here in a second. Here, actually, let's go right into that. Okay. So mappings within the system, these come out of the box. Many of you might be already familiar with the libs, WCM core, resources, languages. We did actually add many languages to this mapping. And this is what the abstract class handles. Never seen that. There we go. That is unique. Anyways, so these mappings are used for many other instances within CQ, but contain what we consider valid I8N language codes. We do within the abstract class have a ignore case rule, so these are all lowercase, but these are the API accepted language codes currently supported by the translation. And as you can see, I wonder if that goes to it is going to go all the way, isn't it? I've never seen that. Let's refresh. That is unique. Anyways, as you can see, these language codes contain the language name as well as possibly a country, if they're country-specific codes, and these are the accepted codes within the system. And as well as this, so this has been added to in 6.0. It did exist prior to this, and it's used for many things, as you're probably familiar with, such as in the URL to map the specific locales within the system as well. We do have a new mapping that's shipping with this. That's a strange thing. We do have a new mapping that's shipped that is these categories mapping. And this is located under libs, grant translation, resources categories. And these contain all the valid categories as well as a description of the category within the system. It's interesting. I got to pick people's brain on that afterwards. I've never seen it behave like that. So we have category education and the string. So this would be like a UI value here. And these are all the categories that currently the API supports. So science, religion. And with these category mappings, and we'll show in the cloud configs, that you can map content to specific categories and label your content so it can route to different engines properly. Now, when I said the connector can implement its own configs, this would be Microsoft's. So Microsoft has its own category mappings, and what this does is, like I said, it's a one-to-one mapping. Refresh this again. A one-to-one mapping of the the category code. So these are the name of the node corresponds to the mappings of the framework, and then the category mapping corresponds to the connector specific code. So in this case, in Microsoft's case, they expect an automotive to have this value. They expect business to have that value. They expect education to have that value when calling their machine translation engine. What this mapping also allows is the connector to narrow the scope. So you would only map nodes. This would be essentially a subset of the API's category mappings. And so within the connector, you would pull the mappings from this location and only allow these specific categories for the Microsoft connector. Similarly, in the language mappings, this maps, let me refresh this. These map code, the API level codes to the specific connector. So in calling through the front end, we expect these codes, the codes that correspond to the node name. And then in the connector, there's logic specific to Microsoft to take anytime someone passes ESDO, that actually gets passed into Microsoft as ES. And if you notice in all these Microsoft specific connectors, Microsoft actually doesn't honor language, the language extension on the I18N codes. That's so funny. I've never seen that. And so that's what I mean. Let's go back to the slideshow. That's what I mean when I say implement connector mappings. So if we go back to the slideshow. Yeah, so again, they provide a one-to-one mapping for the languages as well as the categories.
Hey, Bryce, with that scrolling issue,
yeah.
Zoom out. Zoom out to 100%.
That's interesting. I'll figure it out in a second when I go back. Thanks, though. That's funny. So cloud configurations. Actually, let's get into, now we're talking about implementing. I'd like to actually go into one implementation I have that is a quote-unquote dummy connector. It really actually has no functionality, but it implements the API. I think it might be PowerPoint. Okay. So this is, we call it the quote-unquote dummy connector. It's because it doesn't do anything. Let's look at the translation factory first. So this connector, we can install it successfully in the system. It registers and everything properly. It's just for every function of the translation service, it's not calling out to any machine translation engine. What this allows us to do is test multiple connectors installed within the system and the routing of the translation manager. So as you can see in this, as I showed before, this gets a translation service factory name, and this is the unique property that must be used because that's what is pulled off during activation of the factory. And then this value is the important part. This value must be unique to the system. So within any system that this is installed, there can be only one factory with the value dummy. And again, we can give a label description, and that just goes into the OSGI. So pretty straightforward. And I am setting up in the factory an attribution and a label specific to this. Typically, in the case of the Microsoft connector, these would also be OSGI properties. Obviously, because this is an unimplementation dummy connector, they're just hard-coded strings. But in most connectors, you would probably make those properties at the OSGI level, so you can configure that at that level and change them without having to recompile code. And then we're going to override the, so first and foremost, we're extending the abstract translation factory and implementing the translation service factory. And then we're going to override this create translation service. And all this connector is going to do is return a new dummy translation service implementation. And so this is where I'm saying that the factory is responsible for returning in this create translation service function the connector specific class. And in this one, we are creating a new object for each one of these calls. If you have an activator class within this, you could create a dummy translation service object and just pass that specific object back each time. Or in this case, we're creating a new one each time. The dummy translation service, again, now we are extending the abstract translation service and implementing the translation service. We have a constructor that's calling the this calls the abstract, which is the superclass, and passes in all these specific values to set up the translation service object and whatnot. I think this is slightly a little out of date, but and here the connector itself, in the case of the Microsoft connector, and you can really do this however you want, especially when I showed the language mappings. You know, if you only support one language mapping, you don't necessarily need to create all those content mappings. But specific in the Microsoft connector, it would actually pull from that location I showed previously. But in the case of the dummy connector, we are just creating a new map, and it doesn't support any languages, essentially. And so in the supported languages, we are just returning a map of basically a blank map, essentially. It's that available language map. So in the dummy connector, like I said, there really is no logic. The only logic in every function is to just throw a translation exception. This service is not implemented. With the specific error code, service not implemented. And that is all this does. But if you were to write a connector specific to your machine translation engine, in each one of these functions is where you put the specific logic to call out to your machine translation engine, whether it be locally installed in the system or whether it be via HTTP, some type of HTTP method. And so, as you can see, so let's just quickly talk through the different functions. So is direction supported, whether this connector supports specific language mappings, or language directions. Detect language, pretty straightforward. We pass in a detect source, and we're going to return a language code specific to the language detected or error out. The translate string, again, is returning a translation result from your specific engine. And I'm not going to dig too deep into this. The Java docs are published on this, and there's a lot more detail on each one of these functions, as well as what all the parameters mean, which parameters are optional in the Java docs. And that might be a good thing for a blog post, but like I said, all the Java docs are published out there. Translate array, same thing. This translate string, but passing an array of strings. And then here are our store translation, as well as getting all the stored translations in the system, as well as storing translations in the system with arrays. So this is a real simple implementation, but it does work, and I will show that here in a second. Really, this is all you need. I'm assuming any other connectors that will be written will be much more complex than this. But as bare bones, this is all you need to do to implement the API and get it installed and working within the framework. Okay. Cloud configurations. I'm going to go a little bit fast through the cloud configurations here to get to more of the demo. But there are two types of cloud configurations that are shipped in 6.0. One is the main one, which is the translation integration cloud config. Allows specifying a translation provider connector as well as the default category. This currently also allows the configuration of the quote-unquote common store for user-generated content. And secondly, there's the Microsoft Translator Cloud Config that allows configuration of credentials specific to the Microsoft connector. And it would be expected, unless the credentials are hard-coded, and you can do it different ways, but what we recommend for a new connector would be to create a cloud configuration similar to the Microsoft Translator Cloud configuration. I'll show that here now. Okay. So this is 6.0. We have the translation integration cloud config right here. And out of the box, there are three. Actually, I think this might have been installed with my test page, but it allows you to create new configurations here. And then these can get applied, similar to all the other cloud services, directly to content to essentially provide the translation manager enough information to route to the appropriate translation configuration. And if we go ahead and create a new config, we can see that we are able to find a translation provider. And this is in real time. It actually does. The dropdown shows you all the available connectors installed within the system. And you can see in my system, as well as the Microsoft that comes out of the box, I do have the dummy connector installed, and as well as specific categories. And this would be the default category. If no category is provided, it assumes this is the category of your content. I'm not going to get too much into this, but this user-generated content path is also configured at this level, and this is unique to the comment store and user-generated content, if anyone's familiar with that. And there is actually a pretty good documentation online surrounding this. And one thing of note too is each of these configurations that they ship with this default configuration. Currently in the 6.0, the default configuration is the system-wide cloud config that will be used if no cloud configs are found applied to the content. So when calling the create translation service function at the translation manager level and passing a resource, the logic essentially is it looks at the passed-in resource and looks for the translation integration framework cloud config. If it doesn't find one, it goes to its parent and its parent's parent and all the way up to the root until it either finds or doesn't find a translation integration cloud config. If it doesn't find any, this default config will be what's used. And out of the box, it's configured to point to Microsoft in general. The other cloud config is the Microsoft specific cloud config. So this is specific to the Microsoft connector, and in our opinion, it's the best way to configure credentials for these cloud services for these connectors. And out of the box in 6.0, we ship with these three configurations. Again, the default, if nothing's applied to your site, the default configuration in this case will be used. And I mentioned this, and this is true for 6.0, but in 6.1, both these defaults are migrating to the OSGI level for system level configuration. And then cloud configs will be specific to content. But currently configured, the default takes place if no cloud configs are applied to your content. The default doesn't have any credentials. And then this Microsoft trial license that ships with the product allows anyone that has 6.0 running to use Microsoft's Bing translation engine, and it's free for up to 2 million characters per month. And this is where you configure your client ID, your client secret, and workspace ID. When they purchased from Microsoft into this level, and then the cloud configs are applied at the site level. Sorry, I'm going to go a little quickly here. I think actually, yep. So let's go right to the demo. So first, I'm going to actually show one of the new new components that shipped with AEM6 and one second. So right now, what I have set up is 4 versions of the Geometrics Media site. Out of the box, it only comes with English. I actually created using the language copy tool these other locales. And right now, applied to this, let me show that. If we look in the publish instance, if anyone's familiar, I believe you still have to go to the old Sidekick to actually do cloud configurations. I don't personally. I haven't done it too much, but I haven't found the cloud configurations in the new Touch UI. So that's just more of an FYI for everyone out there. So cloud services are configured at the page properties level, cloud services, and you can see here I have 2 cloud services that are applied. The other thing to note here is that these are actually applied at the content geometrics media level, and they're inherited down at this level. And what this means is that all 4 of my locales will, because it's at geometrics media, one level above the locale level, it will be applied to all of the locales across my site. So I have actually 2 applied, one the Microsoft Translator, and the reason I applied this is because I have the user store configured on that. And Adobe has a pretty good demo on that. And then the credentials of the GeoMedia. So if we go ahead and create a discussion here, you can see how the translation happens in real time. Oh, I might need to log in. So I just created a discussion on my English locale, and previously this wasn't available. So now, if I look on the French locale, it sees that discussion. So now the discussions are all shared across all locales with the common store. And so I can see this in French. It's in English, but now because of the API, I'm able to actually translate this in real time and then respond in real time. So on the Spanish form, if I refresh the page, you'll see the same thing. And in Spanish, this will translate now into Spanish because it knows my context, which is in the Spanish form. And I can respond to them as well in Spanish. On the German form, I get the exact same conversation. And I can see in German all the comments in real time and respond in real time to the forum. And finally, I can come back to the original question I asked the community and see that people have responded. And respond to them all. So this is just one example of a component that gets shipped that uses the API. And sorry, I'm going to go a little quick on this because I know we're running out of time. But on all the forums now, they all share the exact same story across all your user communities, and in real time see in their native language the conversation. So pretty unique, pretty powerful stuff. Let's go right into the code here. And so you're saying, weird. Okay. Okay. Can we just hide that? There we go. Okay, it stopped. Thanks, Dan. TJ. So anyways, it's really this easy. We're going to include the API. I don't know if I necessarily need the Comedy app just for some of the helpers. This is it. These two lines. Translation Manager, like I showed before, Sling, get the Translation Manager. From that Translation Manager, I'm going to create a translation service and pass the resource, which in this case is the current page. And based on that resource passed in, the current page, the Translation Manager will route me to the appropriate translation engine. Based on my inputs, I'm then going to use that this translation service object and either store a translation, I'm not going to show that right now, but or get a translation result. So I'm going to translate the string that's entered and return a result, and then I'm going to display this result.getTranslation. So it really is that simple. And I call it the developer test page. It's pretty bare bones from a UI perspective, but I'm a developer, not a designer. So like I showed you, that creates a translation manager. It takes this input string and it takes my from in two languages, and it's going to return a translation. So if I go ahead and let's say I'm going to translate from Chinese, it says ZH, the code, to English. It translated that Chinese into English. And this right here is an issue with my page. I think it's the character encoding. But so it translated that Chinese string into English, and I can translate that back into Chinese by just translating it from English back to Chinese. And there's the Chinese machine translation of that string. And we see here we can get access to see what the factories are installed in the system. Currently, there's a Microsoft factory and a dummy factory. Also, and I'll show this code here in a second, show all the language codes installed in the system, and show all the categories installed in the system. And that code is very simple as well. There's a translation configuration class, and that handles all the languages, and I'm literally just calling tc.getLanguages and just printing out that language list, as well as translation config.getCategories, and I get all the categories configured in this system. And factory names, based on my translation manager, I can call the getAvailableFactoryNames function, and it will return all the factories within the system. And so literally those three lines printed all that data that you saw on the screen there, and gives you access to what is real-time happening within the system. And we can also see in real time how the connectors, so this These are just bundles installed in the OSGI, and we can start and stop them, and they'll get registered or unregistered in the system. So if we go ahead and stop the Microsoft connector, there's now a resolved bundle, that unregisters it from the translation manager. And so if I go ahead and refresh this, I won't get a Chinese translation anymore because it will only use the dummy connector. This current connector doesn't support translations. We know that because we found that it was thrown through a translation exception, because that's all the dummy connector does. Also, we can see different pieces about the translation service we use, as well as the factories available in the system. And dummies only, the currently one only available. There's only one factory, and dummy is it. And if we go ahead and start Microsoft and stop the dummy connector, do the exact same thing again. This now will use the Microsoft connector. We got our translation. This is an English sentence, but in Chinese. And there is now only the Microsoft installed within the system. So it really allows you to leverage from one component multiple translation engines. And even if I actually stop both of them, resubmit. Now there's no connectors installed in the system because both bundles are stopped. So this in real time allows you to install, uninstall different connectors within the system, and from the same component, I didn't change any code. It called out to various machine translation engines, and is able to, in real time, allow you to translate whatever you like into whatever language you'd like. And so they're back online now. Well, hey, thanks guys for attending. I'm gonna put some contact information up on the screen, and if PowerPoint ever works. Never does it? Thanks for attending. I hope this was useful. Sure, there's probably a lot of questions that came out of this. Feel free to email us. I did used to have TJ's email up there. And feel free to email us or find us out at 6dimensions.com or labs.6dimensions.com as well. And that is so strange. I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of questions. There's plenty of information that if it's not published already, will be published on Adobe's and dev.day.com here in the next couple days. Like I said, the Java docs will be out there. There's a lot more information in the Java docs than I went over here currently. I hope this was helpful to you guys. And we would definitely love to answer questions, write more blog posts about a lot of this stuff. And so I hope you guys use it out there. It's very powerful. There is a lot more coming in the next iterations. I'll obviously leave that to Adobe to announce. But it's pretty exciting to be where we're at with this framework. It's come a long way in the past year. And thanks very much.